All right, we're working on chapter 7, part 1, and this is just a review of what's important. So before you sign off and do the homework and take the quiz, here is some important points for this chapter. One is this: there are three purposes for energy, three or four actually, that we need. The fourth one I don't even list because it's so little amount of energy, but we're bringing it up. I'll bring it up to you. So basal metabolism. Basal means base metabolism. So what is it that takes energy? It's your heart rate, it's the blood flow, it's the smooth muscle contractions. The things you don't even think about are it's called basal metabolism. That's what keeps your a need for energy up and keeps your metabolism moving. Physical activity, of course, we know about that. And the third one is digestion. There's a certain amount of energy it takes to digest food. You have to break down macronutrients. You have to things need to take ATP to move in and out of cells. So that is considered the thermal effect of food. So that's another name for that digestion. The fourth one that we didn't really count as a general purpose is just a little bit of energy it takes to keep our temperature up. So if you are hypothermia, people in hypothermia tend to sleep because their energy, they have so little energy to keep their temperature up so that they don't want to use it for anything else. So if you are cold, you tend to shiver. If you don't have clothing to keep yourselves warm, that takes energy. So that's a slight amount of energy need. In addition to that, the breakdown is about 60% of your energy is basal metabolic rate, just keeping your temperature, or keeping your digestion going, keeping your heart rate going, keeping blood moving and all that. So that's the highest proportion of what your energy needs are. Secondly is physical activity, and third is the digestion, the thermal effect of food. So you can see that it's pretty important that just basal metabolic, even if you weren't active at all, you still need quite a few calories just to maintain your body's functions. So here's the example of when they determine the basal. So BMR is the calories used when fasting. So they actually figured it out by having people like to sleep, not eating, and just determining like in a dark room, what are their calorie needs when they're not doing anything else. So the more lean, one thing they found out is the more lean tissue a person has, the higher the BMR. Just maintaining muscle takes more energy than maintaining adipose tissue. And so there's a formula for that to figure out. You can figure out your BMR by just taking your weight, again, convert it to kilograms. So divide your weight in pounds by 2.2 to get your weight in kilograms. Make sure you remember how to do that. And then multiply that number by 1, which is pretty easy for a guy. And then multiply that number by 24 hours to determine how many calories you burn in one day just for your basic metabolic rate. For women, you use the zero 0.9 calories per hour instead of 1. So that is something you can figure out. I think it might be on your homework. So here is what can affect your BMR. So it's not just your gender. So we noticed that guys and girls had a little different number they multiplied by. It's your body temperature, how much thyroid hormone you have because that affects your metabolism, whether you're eating or not, how big you are, how tall. If you're under any stress, it takes more energy. How old you are, how much food you've eaten, because if you eat more food, it actually takes more energy. If you're pregnant, if you're growing, all these things affect your BMR. In addition to that, look at this one. Here we have to talk about a different kind of fat. So there are some fats in our body that actually take more energy. So even though I said that fat, doesn't take as much, the BMR, if you have more fat or more adipose tissue, you have a lower BMR. But there's two different kinds of fat. One is called brown adipose fat, and one is called white. And we just call it BAT fat or WAT fat. So BAT fat can determine your efficiency. So young babies, when babies have a lot of baby fat, we call it, that's a lot of brown fat, which has a higher metabolic rate. It actually burns energy quickly for heat. So that's how these babies stay warm, is the extra fat. But it's a different type of fat. And it tends to form in these different parts around your neck and your shoulders and around your heart. And so this is a thermogenic fat that helps give you more energy and give you more heat. So it takes more energy to maintain that kind of fat versus white adipose fat or WAT fat. That is what you tend to see in someone that has abdominal obesity. So the fat around your stomach is called Is a white fat, the visceral fat, and that doesn't take as much energy to maintain. In fact, it actually is negative and it causes chronic disease such as diabetes to have that kind of fat. So that's just an interesting concept. Here's another thing that's important to remember, that your BMR, so again, just make sure you multiply your weight times the calories times 24 hours. So there's several steps to that. So this girl who's 130 pounds is 59 kilograms times 0.9 because she's a female, and times 24. So she needs 1,276 calories just to maintain her BMR. It's not adding any activity or any digestion of any sort. So that just gives you an example of how that works. And then here is another step. Just remember that if there's something called positive and negative energy balance, what would that be? So if you're in positive energy balance, that means you're actually consuming more food than you're expending. If you're in negative energy balance, that means you're consuming less than you expend. So you'll be losing weight in that case. So those are in terms. So here's examples. So this person is in equilibrium. He burns the same amount of fat or energy that he ingests. This person is in positive energy balance, meaning that she takes more food in than she expends. So you get a weight increase. That's the whole balance between weight, calories in, and calories out, to see that you maintain a weight. And just, sometimes we vary our weight by just a couple pounds or even 4 or 5 pounds in one workout or in one day. So we're not talking about 2 to 5 pounds. We're talking about maybe gaining or losing 10 pounds, a larger amount. Another thing we might be figuring out in this chapter is how do we measure calories? So how do we know how many calories are in the food we're eating? So this is a way you can do it. You kind of burn the food, and it's called a bomb calorimeter. So you're burning food to see how much energy it releases. So here it has water. There's water surrounding this container where the food is. You start a little fire, you burn this food, and you measure. The thermometer measures the water. So you look at the temperature of the water before and after you burn it, and that determines how much energy that food released when it was consumed by oxygen, by fire. And so that tells you how many calories that food has. So that's one way the food industry can tell you how many calories are in the foods that they post. Another thing to look at would be this would determine energy. So now we want to look at, how do we determine how much energy we consume? How do we know how much we consume? So that's what's called EER, or the estimated energy requirement. And this is different for everybody because it is based on your age, your activity, your height, and your weight. So it's going to be very particular to individuals. And there's two ways you can do this. You can just do it by the formula, where you plug in your weight and your activity and so forth, or you can do it with some mechanical devices that actually measure in the same way they measure the calories in food. Now, you don't burn your body, but you can see how many calories you expend. So here this tells you, like, if you were highly active, you would use a different multiplier than if you were sedentary to determine your energy needs. So here's the formula, which we'll use in a different chapter. I don't think it's in this chapter, but you would plug in this formula your age, your physical activity, your height, your weight, and then you determine your energy needs based on that. So that is particular to each individual. And then to assess your weight, then you would determine your BMI, your waist circumference. You could do it by any one of these three, or you could determine your body fat, and then your special equipment for that. So you can do your body weight by BMI, which does not consider body fat. It just looks at overall weight and compares you to other people of the same height that you're at to see what their weight is. Or you can look at your waist circumference. So for guys, it shouldn't probably go over 40 inches, and for girls, 38. Those are considered, points where you don't want to go over, because it's usually too much and it can lead to chronic disease. So we can do it three different ways. You just saw the formula for doing EER, but how do you figure out BMI? So BMI, since you're just looking at your weight and height, you simply take your weight in kilograms and divide it by your height in meters squared. If you don't like working with a metric system, you can just take your pounds times 703 and divide it by your height in inches squared. Just remember these inches and pounds have to be the right, use the right indices. So here's an example. If you find out your BMI is less than 18.5, then you're underweight. If you find it's over 30 or over, you're considered obese. If it's 25 or over, you're considered overweight. And that depends. Like for elderly people, this is actually a good, the overweight isn't bad for elderly because they can get sick and they need the extra reserves of fat. But for most adults, and this is for age 18 or 20 and up, we're not talking about children, we're just talking about adults and how they should, what's a good range. But of course, this could be an athlete could have a very high BMI but not be overweight because they can have muscle mass. So this is not telling you your body fat content. It's just telling you how you compare to other people of the same height. And then if you have too much, oh, it's 35 for women. So 40 for men, 35 for women. So if your waist is larger than 35 as a female, that's considered a high risk. They've done a lot of studies on different individuals and found that that just makes a difference, that women that have a higher or men that have a higher than 40-inch waist have a higher propensity of insulin resistance, diabetes, and chronic disease. And there's something called the metabolic syndrome, which it puts all these together, these factors that combined put us at higher risk. So there's that white fat around the abdomen, and those, if those indices are met, then they're considered high risk. Also, if your triglycerides are high, if you have blood work done, if your HDL is too low, if you're high blood pressure, or you have fasting glucose that's too high, if you have 3 of these factors, then you're considered a higher risk for chronic disease. So the weight is important as well as other indices. So that's something to remember. So these are some ways you can measure your body fat, besides just figuring out the your calorie needs. You can go underwater weighing. You can look underwater and see what you weigh and buoyancy. So because fat floats, you can tell. They can do a comparison of your weight before and after underwater, and that's one way to, it's quite an accurate way. It's a little messy. You can watch this video about how it's actually done, and usually they do several trials because they aren't always that good the first time through. And then another way to measure your weight would be the air displacement by a bod pod. So you can you can sit in this very tight, compact space, and then it measures the volume and air displacement. It takes, I forget how long, maybe half an hour or so. You can determine your body density by the weight and the volume. And so that's another way, if you can get that equipment. A third way is skin fold measure. So since there is a little visceral fat just below your skin, you can actually just measure the thickness of the skin, and that's another pretty accurate way to determine how much fat your body has. And another way is bioelectric impedance. So this one you can measure by the slight electric pulse going through your body, and it can determine where the fat is versus the bone and the water. And so forth. And the DEXA scan is a very expensive way, but this is another way, like an X-ray type thing. It can tell you your fat versus your bone and your skin. So those are a few methods you can determine your fat content or your muscle content. The last thing to remember here in this chapter is this, that why do we gain and lose weight? Depends on a lot of things. Depends not just on our activity, but also on our genetics, what are our metabolic factors, how fast we burn calories, how we're doing with the energy in and out, how we feel psychologically and physiologically. If we have any illnesses or broken legs or whatever, we obviously can't exercise. And then another point to remember is that the hypothalamus is the part of the brain that does control our hunger and our thirst and our body temperature. So our brain is sort of like the head control center for all these things. That's something to remember. And then another thing, the last couple things to remember for this chapter is that if your normal weight, you might be normal weight, but you still could have a lower lean body mass, so you may not be that healthy even if your weight is normal, because you might not have much lean body mass. You could be overweight, but you could have more lean body mass than another person who is not as heavy as you are. Also, it depends on your how much energy you burn for a digestion, how much fat you oxidize, and how quickly you oxidize it in your metabolic rate. So there's a lot of things that determine what your weight is going to be. But the lower, they have determined the less you eat, the lower your BMR would be. So it's not a good idea to go long periods without food, because it actually slows your metabolism. By increasing your food intake, it increases your TEF, your thermal effect of food. And then increasing activity can also increase your BMR, and you'll have lower weight gain. So those are just some indices that will affect your overall weight. So you can take a look at the review questions in the slides, and these are some points to remember.